Welcome everyone. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm very happy to see you live in person. Okay, so before we begin, usually I would say mute yourself in the Zoom environment, but please turn your phones off or silent now that we're back live. All right, so today is the 1st of October and it's also the first day of the DataFest event, the opening ceremony. We're very happy to have you here. My name is Liz Guzman Ramirez. I am the research data steward for ERIM, so I support RSM and ESD. And Muteleni is here supporting me. So this DataFest event is a collaboration between ERIM and the library. So Muteleni is here, the project management of the library. She will be supporting me with the YouTube because we are streaming live in the ERIM channel. And so she will be checking questions and everything she will send through us. All right, so today is the first day of 10 events of the whole DataFest campaign. I wish to see you in all of them. And we will have a lot of topics, but mostly today we will touch on open science and reproducibility. So today we're joined by Pursey Heugens. He's a professor in organizational theory, development, and change at the Department of Strategy Management and Entrepreneurship for the Rotterdam School of Management. He's also the scientific director of ERIM, the boss of my boss. And he recently been appointed the Open Science Ambassador for the whole Erasmus University. We're also joined by Christophe Pérignon. He's a professor in finance and associate dean of research at HEC Paris in France. And he's also the co-holder of the chair in regulation and systemic risk of the Banque de France. In 2012, he co-founded the runmycode.org, an academic website allowing researchers to share their code and data associated with their scientific papers. And in 2019, he launched Cascad, the first certification agency for scientific codes and data that he will be talking about today. So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Without any further ado, I'll give the floor to Pursey.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the October DataFest. And I'm going to announce OZAP-est, right? I mean, let the beer flow, so to speak, but at this time, the data. I want to thank you all for being here very, very much. And also, especially because you, by being here, you signal that you want to partake in this journey towards open science, so to speak, or at least want to find out more about what it is, or to see how your experiences compare to those of others. And that is great, and that's good and encouraging news, because I think that open science, in especially a discipline such as management, is kind of challenging. But it's challenging in a way that it's also challenging for our university as a whole. Now, why is that the case? Because management is a super heterodox discipline, right? We've got so many different epistemic communities, people who do research in very, very different ways, that there is no one answer to what open science is or can ever become, right? We have to think about how we can take the essential functions of open science and how we can tailor them to the needs of each individual epistemic community that is part of that lovely heterodox discipline that we call management. And so I would like to call for two things, or would like to at least help you understand our challenges here in two different ways. The one is that we could have taken a very philosophical approach, right, and tried to figure out what the perfect approach to open science is before we start doing stuff, and we can talk about culture, and we can talk about ideas until we saw blue in the face. But what I prefer to do, and I think the DataFest is a good example of that, is that we try to strive for something that I would lovingly call robust action, right? Stuff that you can always do and that is good under any state of the future. And one of the things that I think that is good in any event is to get in touch with and to start understanding the infrastructure behind open science, right? Just all the stuff that you can do, that you can play with, that you can work with, in order to make your own scientific processes a little bit more open, to involve a few more people in that, and to start sharing some of the stuff that you do with others. Also to use open science as a generative force. Now, the way that we have tried to do that indeed is to develop a kind of 3-year open science campaign where each year in March, like this year where we took the Orchid March Madness month, loosely based on the US collegiate basketball, but it's a minor aside. Where we use the Orchid March Madness month just to get everyone started, to see whether your Orchid works, to see whether your Orchid page works, just to start disclosing it in a simple way. That's behavior, right? That's not complicated words like culture. There's no deep philosophy behind it. It's just traceable behavior towards opening up and making stuff a little bit more traceable. Now we're kicking off the October DataFest, and here also our ambitions are very modest, right? We all want you to just get in touch with with some of the infrastructure at least for making your data more public, more open, more transparent, more traceable, and as we're going to hear in a little bit, perhaps also more your results more reproducible. The second thing that I just want to lay out there as a challenge is that because we are a heterodox community with multiple epistemic communities all living under one roof, right, or under 2 roofs, we obviously operate at different speeds, and we all have to think about different ways about how we can make open science work within our communities. We're going to get an example from finance, and finance has benefited tremendously from being a discipline that has been wedded to econ and therefore has essentially started their learning curve 20 years before, for example, people in my field, in organization theory, started theirs. Also, another clear distinction between Christophe's field and my field is that in my field people work a lot, for example, with qualitative data, which have oftentimes interpretivist philosophies and epistemologically connected to them. And that also will call for a different idea of how you can make your data open or how you can make your ideas open to others. And what I hope is that we can all respectfully learn from one another, right? I mean, obviously Christophe's experiences may map onto yours for the full 100%, or they may be fully orthogonal. But I've heard his story before, and I think it is a great and truly inspirational story. And even if it is different, it is a story that will cause you to think about your own routines, and I hope that you can respectfully do it in that way as well. I'm not the star of the show today, Christophe is, so I'm going to shut myself up right here. I wish you a lovely campaign month, and I wish Liz, who is very nervous about this, many registrants at any of these sessions that are going to come ahead, Mutalani too. Before we go any further, I would just like to get a brief round of applause for Liz and Mutalani, who worked wonders to make It's a lot more applause than I usually get, so I feel good to want to go. So no more clapping, but I would like to give it up to Christophe and enjoy the show, I would say. Good luck.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really honored to be the first speaker of this long series. So I'm really impressed with what you do at Rotterdam. I come from HEC Paris, and this is a very good research institution. We used to be in the top 3, according to Financial Times, in terms of research, but because of you, now we are top 4. Rotterdam just kicked us out from the podium, so I have to figure out what is your secret. Anyway, I'm here to talk about open science in general and Cascad, the project that we are pushing in France and in economics and finance. Yeah, so first of all, I would like to tell you more about what we call reproducibility, research reproducibility. The terminology is very important, it's kind of vague too. So I will start with this, because that's an important part of open science. So open science is a part of science. Science is useful if and only if it's novel, trustful, and available. And this open science movement is focusing on this availability here. They want to be sure that society will benefit from what we collectively produce. They want the output, both publications, data, and code, to be accessible to all levels of society. Of course, to researchers, PhD students, but also policymakers, companies, and the general public. So that's the whole beautiful idea behind open science. Many of us, we try to make publications available, and there is, especially in Europe, open access, golden access, plan S. I'm not going to talk about that at all. I'm talking about making sure that data and code can be accessed and used and rerun, in the case of computer code, by other researchers. That's the type of contribution we try to make here. I told you that the terminology is a little bit confusing, so let me try to define what we mean by research reproducibility. And the best definition we came up with, and we're inspired by those researchers here, is the definition saying that results are considered reproducible if and only if another researcher can regenerate the result from the code and the data, as well as from the instructions shared by the original author. I like this definition for many reasons. First of all, you see that it's not only about sharing code and data. Code and data, most of the time, they are not very useful if you don't get enough explanation about how, what are the steps you're supposed to follow. The README file has to be very well done and complete, etc. Another thing I like is that you see that this other researcher, that can be the original researcher at a later point in time. So a little bit provocative, but if you are yourself researcher, you see what we mean when we talk about that. Even for us to regenerate our own results at a later point in time can be challenging. Okay? So if we sum up, reproducibility or computational reproducibility is just defined as checking whether same data to same method gives the same result. And then for an example in economics, Cheng and Lee in the American Economic Review, they just select 60 papers published in ER, they access the data, they access all the code, and they just try to reproduce the result that you see in the tables and in the figures. And as you will see, most of the time they fail. And then another very interesting concept, I may say much more interesting, is replicability. Replicability is what science is about. Replicability is you check whether if you change the data and you keep the method constant, whether you still get the same result, the same conclusions. Or you keep the same data, but you want to use an alternative econometric technique, and then you're checking whether your results or your conclusions hold true. Okay? So that's robustness, that's sensitivity analysis, etc. And one example is Cameraire. They redo a series of experiments in economics. They just regenerate the data, if you want, by reconducting the same experiment. Okay. So why it's important for a result or scientific result to be reproducible? It's very important because I may say that's the very minimum we can ask to a so-called scientific results. If you don't comply with this very minimal requirement, maybe you're not science. Okay. Another thing is that if you make the code and the data available, if you make a good job explaining, in the README file, what are the different steps, another research should follow, you make the life of the other researchers easier if they want to go further, to replicate, to test for robustness of the results, sensitivity analysis. So often this reproducibility is just one step, but sometimes it's a necessary condition to go to the next step, which is again much more interesting. Okay? And also very important for the diffusion of new ideas, because now the code is available, someone can take this piece of code and then build on it. Okay. And then if you know as a researcher that someone else will verify, will rerun everything, I think this is a source of motivation for you to exert a little bit more effort when you double check everything, when you document everything. And when you do so, you may find mistakes that you make. Okay? So I guess it's going to lower the likelihood of having mistakes in what you produce. So if you think about our previous slide about the definition of science, the definition of open science, we're very at the core of the scientific activity here, because here we are in the process of making results more trustful, and we're also making results more easier for all the researchers to use. So in my field, economics, we saw journals implementing so-called data availability policy, or data and code availability policy, this DAP acronym that you will see in several of my slides. As early as in the 90s, we have journals implementing the first policy. So introducing, sometimes not implementing, but it's always having a rule and implementing the rule. That can be different. And then JMCB is is a pioneer journal. And then you have the top journals later. You have the early adopter, like American Economic Review, and then the other guys following, etc. And now most of the journals, they have their own policy. If we zoom in on American Economic Review, we see that this journal was created in 1911, and then for more than 80 years, there was like no advice, no policy to comply with as an order. And it's only in 2004 that then the managing editor, it was Ben Bernanke back then, after like not a scandal, but some issues with one paper being published and showing that the result of another American Economic Review, they were kind of fragile because they were unable to reproduce the result. It was kind of a big concern. They decided to introduce this so-called data and availability policy. Okay, but then it was just like a rule, but it was not really enforced, and it's only recently, like in 2018 and 19, that they started to verify and to rerun everything. So basically, what we do in our paper that we wrote with my colleagues is to decompose the life of a journal in terms of reproducibility. The first stage is there is no reproducibility policy, okay? And then you enter into a second phase where there is a reproducibility policy, but it's not very, it's not verified what you share, and the results are not going to be regenerated independently. And then you end up to a third phase, which is what I call serious work, which is verified reproducibility policy. And this journal now entered, one of the very first ones to invest in this in a serious manner, and they enter into this verified reproducibility policy. So what is the current level of reproducibility in our field? As I said, nowadays most journals in economics would have a data availability policy, and they would have data availability policy. If we focus on those journals with a DAP, the vast majority, they will have their own archive system to store code and data on their own website, and 14% of them, they would suggest to use an existing and external data and code repository, ICPSR or Zenodo, Dataverse at Harvard, and Run My Code, which is our own archive system, can be used by journals. So that's kind of the rule. Now we can look at more carefully about the enforcement of the rule. The researchers looking at the enforcement, they typically show this type of results. This paper in Nature by Gertler, again in economics, they focus on the 203 economic papers published in the top economic journals, and the main message here is that more than 80% of these papers, they will not have the resources available to reproduce the result. And another interesting result, just like 14% of the papers considered in this study, for 14% of the papers, they have been able to rerun something. I'm not talking about regenerating exactly the same result, just rerunning something. Again, pretty scary. Cheng and Lee, they have 67 papers published in the American Economic Review. For all of them, they have all the resources. Okay? So I'm not talking about all the papers for which you don't have the resources. I'm focusing on a very small sample of papers with everything, and they have been able to regenerate the result for 1/3 of them. Okay? Again, I don't care whether it's 1/3 or 40% or 20%. No, it's a small fraction, even if we talk about the very top journals of our field. Especially if we compare also economics with other scientific areas, political science, sociology, psychology, they also have pretty serious quantitative analysis in all these areas. And this is a study, again, by Gertler published in 2018 in Nature. So economics is not bad compared to the other ones, but economics, we ask a lot for data and code, but we don't verify. The verification is in red here. So there is one, back then in 2018, it was one pilot in a journal in political science, so they were ahead of us. Now things are changing slightly, as I did show you for American Economic Review, but there is no verification. So how can we improve the situation? What we push for in our research and also at Cascad, as I'm going to show you, is pre-publication verification of the reproducibility. So if we follow an idea, so you have an idea, you write a draft, and then you submit a paper, and then you get several revisions, and then eventually the paper is so-called conditionally accepted by the journal. All the referees sign off, and the editor is happy with the paper. Okay. The paper is not accepted yet. You have to go through an extra step. We are enriching the peer reviewer process. And then what we do here in this pre-publication verification process, we just like take the code and the data, if we can access them, and we run everything. And then if we get exact same result, then the paper will go to print. Okay. So first of all, when you receive the material, you have to check whether everything is complying with the guideline, etc. It's well explained, and then you do this comparison by rerunning everything, as I just told you. Follow these 2 steps. And that's who should do this verification. One kind of maybe natural but maybe naive idea would be to ask to the journals themselves. There is an editorial team managing a journal, so you can ask to the same guys who also add another kind of duty and to do this pre-publication verification. They will not have the time, they may not have the talent or skills to do that, and they may also face some conflict of interest, because let's say you accept a paper from a big guy because the paper is fantastic, blah, blah, and then you rerun the code and then you don't find the same results, and are you going to go back to the big guy and say, no, I like the second idea when you completely disconnect this verification work, and then some journals, they appoint a dedicated data editor with a team with different skills. We talk about like running a bunch of code written in a dozen of languages on clouds and virtual machine. There's a lot of different set of skills than the one you need to run efficiently a journal. So you appoint a team and you ask them to take this to do this job. That's exactly what the American Economic Review, Review of Economic Studies, or economic journals in the UK decided to do recently. Okay? And as an alternative or as a complement, you may think of a third party to whom you would ask to conduct this verification on behalf of the journal. So the journal would be outsourcing this verification to a specialized agency. That's what we do at Cascad in France. An obvious advantage is economy of scale, because again, we need to access sometimes confidential databases. So there's a huge entry cost. There's a huge fixed cost to pay. So if we have kind of if we can work with several journals, make more sense rather than each journal trying to access this confidential data. And as I said, the American Economic Review is doing exactly what we said before, appointing a dedicated team, a data editor, and they did this in 2019, and now they work with several third parties, including Cascad. So, more specifically about Cascad, you understood. I think this background information was useful for you to understand where we come from and how we can contribute to this important debate. So Cascad is an acronym. It stands for Certification Agency for Scientific Code and Data. And I guess you understood what we do, which is like take code and run them on the same data as the others. And if there is no discrepancy between what we find and what they report in the paper, we will deliver a certificate attesting this match here. If you want to know more about that, there is a video available on YouTube describing what we do. You mentioned in your introduction the story of Cascad, because if we have time, I will tell you more about. This is not the first idea we had when we were talking about helping the research community. We came up first with let's create a place where researchers could easily share their code and data. And then we realized it was kind of naive, because just sharing is not enough. You really want to check the quality of the resources which is shared. Otherwise, it looks like it's open science, but it's kind of, in my opinion, kind of sometimes not very useful open science. And then in the second stage later, 7 years later, we say, oh, we need a second idea, and that's the second idea. It's also interesting that we were targeting researchers. We wanted to help our fellow researchers to signal the reproducible nature of their research. And then as we work on this, we are shifting a little bit, as I will tell you, and we work more now with journals and less so with individual researchers. But if an individual researcher is asking us to review, to certify his or her research, he or she will have to provide us with the paper, with the code, and with the data. In economics, as you know, a significant fraction of what we do is based on data that cannot be shared because of copyright, because of DNA we sign with companies, with public administrations, you name it, etc. So what we do, sometimes we can access a public version of the data, that's fine. Sometimes we have a temporary access to a restricted access data. Sometimes we receive an anonymized version of the data, or a synthetic version of the data, not exactly the same, but kind of the same. So we have a lot of heterogeneity in terms of data. And then we appoint a reproducibility reviewer or replicator. He or she will run the code and check what we obtain with what is in the paper. If there is no discrepancy, we deliver a certificate, and this certificate can be sent by the authors along with the manuscript when the author, the researcher is submitting to a journal. Again, signaling tool, say that I have nothing to hide, it has been reproduced by a third party. Okay? And then when we conduct this reproducibility, what we do is just like, again, it's not rocket science, but we just like copy what we have in the paper and what we obtain when we rerun everything. Every time there is a discrepancy, we highlight the discrepancy, and if we have no discrepancy, we deliver a high rating, and if we have some discrepancy, we lower the rating. So we reproduce all the figures in the paper, from the paper, what we get, from the paper, what we get. We can have also some fancy figures. This is a recent paper that we have to work with data from the NASA about the quantity of flights in different locations in the world. So we had to redo some fancy maps. Sometimes we have the output from the code that we have to reprocess using a data visualization tool to make this very nice maps that you can see in papers. And then when it has been certified, again, we deliver the highest potential reproducibility score or certificate if there is no discrepancy, so it's RRR. So we act a little bit like a credit rating agencies. We don't analyze bonds issued by corporations, but we analyze, we verify the work of our peers. But then we got some inspiration from them. RRR, perfect reproducibility, R, single D. D stands for discrepancy, or severe discrepancy, which is double D. It's terrible. And then the researchers, it's up to them when they contact us. Disclose and not disclose, again, same thing with credit rating agencies. If you get a bad rating from your bonds, you're not going to put this in the public domain. Anyway, so once you get your rating, we will put some information online, the article, the reproducibility certificate, what I did, this is showing the certificate, the execution report, what I did show you before, from the paper and what we got, and the code and data. Often, the researchers, they prevent us from sharing this for various reasons. Sometimes they don't have, because of legal obligation, sometimes because of competition, they don't want some of their competitors to access this resource that they spend years to develop, etc. So that's the type of thing you can see, and we put everything on Zenodo, which is a fantastic archive system developed by the CERN in Europe, in Switzerland. So we partner with several journals. So one partnership we have is with the journals of the American Economic Association. So based on the data editor report in 2021, they mentioned that they do part of the job internally with the dedicated team I was referring to. But then for 36 papers, they had to rely on an outside service, the subcontractor, suppliers, and out of the 36 reports, we did at Cascad 21 of them. So most of the time it's because the researchers, they use confidential data. So we access data that will show you from public administration in France, but also in Sweden and also in Germany. And they were not able to ask permission to access the raw data because they are located in North America, and often you have to be physically located in continental Europe. So that's why that's another reason for them to use us. Yeah, so talking about the French French context, French is a very centralized country. And there are some problems with this, but the big advantage in terms of data access is that we have a single place where researchers can access micro data generated by ministries and public administrations, etc. And this is called CASD in French. So you have all the tax records, individual tax records for companies, health data. It's not as good as what they have in Northern Europe, like in Sweden, in Finland, but it's pretty good. They know a lot of stuff about us. And they can track us through time for data about health, etc. Great resource for researchers. 300 plus data sets that more than 500 research teams are playing with. So we have a partnership with them. As a result, we have a permanent access to all this data, and then we can rerun any computer code based on this data. So the way it works, this is a researcher allowing or accessing one of the numerous confidential data sets available at CASD. They need to go through like a whole process and present their work, etc. So when they get access to this, they will access a virtual machine through a device with which is fingerprint protected. So this researcher can access a small like cloud or virtual machine on which he or she will get this data set, confidential data set, all the software they need, Python, MATLAB, etc. Stata. They run the analysis. When they're happy with the result, they ask permission to extract this result out of this high security cloud system and put this in the paper, publish the paper. Okay? Those guys, they were challenged because they say, yeah, but you're using data that nobody else can access. You guys are in France, blah, blah, blah. So we say, okay, why not allowing us to access the very same data? So within 48 hours, if the researcher is asking, or if the journal is asking, we can get a clone of the virtual machine with exactly the same data. The beauty of it is that we go back all the way up to the raw data. We're not using data that has been cleaned, etc. We can really go back to the very raw data and do exactly the same step. And then if we end up with the same result, again, we can produce a certificate. So I've been talking a lot about economics, finance, and management because this is where we are active in and where we do research in. But as you can guess, and as you recognize in the introduction, this is a broad issue. And we recently contributed to a report produced by the European Union about research reproducibility in all fields. And if you want to know more about that, please have a look at this document, which was published in December 2020. So I don't know how much time I did spend, but I'm running out of slides, but not of things to say about Cascad in particular and about research reproducibility in general. So I will stop here and I will take questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so we have some questions, but I would like to start with the audience, if the audience has some questions first. Yeah, please.
In one of your earlier slides, you mentioned working with synthetic data.
Yeah.
Do you have any experience with different packages for generating this synthetic data? And are there particular ones you would recommend as more, let's say, trustworthy than others?
We don't generate the synthetic data. We receive synthetic data from researchers themselves. Okay. But I've been working with synthetic data, but synthetic data means very different things. Sometimes synthetic data is just like a white noise generated by the researchers because they use an n times k matrix with confidential data which they cannot share. So they are going to provide me with an n times k matrix with white noise, and just I'm going to plug this, inverse the matrix, get crazy result, get some results. They show me that the code is running, but it's not very interesting from a scientific point of view. I have other researchers matching moment very carefully of the true data, so they estimate a model like a DGP on the true data, and then they use this estimate or calibrated model to generate data which are different, anonymized, that's sure, shareable, but smart data that match nicely the true one. So that's another thing. A last example that I've been using, because I was using confidential data about retail borrowers asking loans to banks. So I have some confidential data about that, which I cannot share. But I teamed up with a startup active in the medical studies using anonymizing patient data. So what they're going to do is they generate some artificial individuals by clustering algorithms that looks very similar to the true one, but you cannot reverse engineer the data set and go back to the true one. So huge series of tools which could be used. But again, we receive synthetic, we don't generate the synthetic data. But that would be a service that we could add to what we currently do, because usually the researchers, they have no clue. Some are experts. Most of the researchers, they need some help to do this.
Thank you. Is there, yes?
So you're checking whether the results in the tables and figures look like the same if you run the code yourself, but do you also check whether the code actually does what the paper says it should be doing, in the, like if you compare the equation to the code?
There is many things we don't do. What you just said, this is not something we do. Another thing we don't do, and then we go back specifically to your question, we don't check whether we can find mistakes in the code.
Yeah.
Because what you said is a type of mistake, having a mismatch between what you claim in the paper and what the code do. This is not something we do. And again, in my presentation, I said reproducibility is not a very high level of requirements. But what I like with this is that usually it's a first step, because when I work on reproducibility, I will make sure that we have enough information about the description of the code. The data we have issues, but the code usually it can be shared. So other researchers can have a look and do this verification of the mapping that you're referring to, or potentially spotting errors. Usually, sometimes we do identify errors just by, not by mistake, but this is not what we are supposed to do, and then you see it makes no sense. But this is not our job.
Thank you.
I would like to know, because you said that researchers can send you their paper and they make the data available somehow and you can check you. Do you have guidelines, for example, on how to document their coding or their analysis journey before they hand it in to you?
Yeah, we are part of a movement. We don't work in isolation. We work with data editor of leading journals in our field, and all together we try to set standards. It's super important. Some researchers they would love to comply with this, but they comply with what? So we use the same guideline as the American Economic Association, which are evolving, which are getting more and more clear, etc. Yeah, we don't even have our own. We just rely on their own. Okay, the same at Review of Economic Studies. They try to work together instead of having different set of rules.
I would like to mention we've got a question when on the registration you could send questions in from a researcher from RSM, and the question is, how will certification work for scientific code where the code is a machine learning algorithm that dynamically updates its training data?
Every time I have a question like this, I say, okay, if I can solve 25% of the problem, that's already not bad. But then people will keep talking about the 75% that I'm not solving. But yeah, no, exactly. But even less extreme case than this one, sometimes we have like researchers they have a snapshot from a database at a given point in time, they do all the analysis, blah, 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 and then they produce a paper, and then they ask for verification, or the journal will ask for verification, and then we go back to the same data, and the data is not the same. Now, this is problematic. In some cases, it's very well done. Versioning is very clear. You have like a vintage. Sometimes it's not clear at all. So we go back to the same data, and then we don't have the same results. So in this particular case, maybe we would struggle, and but I would love to talk more about with your colleagues and see whether we can help him or her.
Thank you. I do have another question for both of you, Pursey and Christophe. Where do you think the future of open data is? Where are we going with open data?
You know, open data in our field is we see kind of the opposite. We see more and more closed data, which again for me is great. I'm not maybe you would disagree. I'm not an open data advocate. My contribution is to help researchers, you know, who wants to make their research for policy, but that's my contribution. I think it's great to have more open data, but in our field, what I see it's more closed data. I'm very happy when I see colleagues, convincing companies to provide amazing data sets and signing NDAs. I think this is one way to push science and to be innovative. That's fantastic. I'm not pushing for all the data to be in the public domain. But of course, having more public data coming from the government, I think this is opening some new area. This is great. But we have both.
Yes, what I would add is that Christophe started with a confession, right? And his confession is that he doesn't care too much about open access of publications because ultimately we can get access to people's ideas, right? And people will share, and so we don't have to squander lots of taxpayers' money on open access per se, because ultimately, if you want to get access to the ideas, then you can one way or the other. I think the other confession is that and I think that he also said something like that to that effect, that open data per se, certainly in management, may not always be the biggest bottleneck. I think that in management we oftentimes struggle more to get the instruments out in public. And if you are in data science, then it is the code. If you do qualitative research, it is, for example, about your coding protocol and documenting the coding process very well. If you do survey research or psychometric research in the lab, then it's about making sure that your scales and your manipulations are out in the open. And if you want to use open science as a generative force for management, then I think that we need to go a lot further also in making our instruments available for other researchers. And so I think that open access and open data are important, but for management oftentimes the true crux is in, or the entire proof of the pudding is also in making sure that the underlying instruments are also available, I would say.
Excellent, thank you. I would like to thank Christophe again, please. And I just have some closing remarks very quickly. But you please,
Yeah, sure. Just getting my phone.
yeah, okay. Thank you. All right, so okay, yes. Thank you everyone for joining us. I want to thank Professor Enrico Penix, to joining us as well today. He's the Vice Dean of the School of Economics. So we're very pleased that we are supported by both RSM and ESE top level. We have a lot of sessions, as I mentioned. This is the first of 10 sessions during the whole month, so I hope to see you there. I have a very small thank you gift for the speakers, but so the audience doesn't feel left out, I put some of you in below your chairs will find a sticker. I post it, and you will get the same gift for some of you, so that you don't feel left out. The ones for the speakers. Yeah. This is so just so you know, Christophe mentioned Zenodo, which is a repository. We have Figshare. So Figshare is a repository that we use. It's the Erasmus data repository. So I'll give you the.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And underneath your chair, then bring it to us and we give you a copy. Gift code from Picture. Thank you so much. We have some drinks and refreshments at the back. So I hope to see some of you and hope to see you in the next event on Monday, starting next month. Thank you so much.
Always wanted to have one.